if you can change your focus, you can change your future. And Oprah lit up and she goes, I love that. And so when the cameras came on, Oprah's got this big smile and she's got the book and she's like endorsing me.
Find something that you is play and others is work, right?
If it says do not push, I push. If it says do not pull this thing when you're in Europe and in the bathroom, I wonder what this is for. I learned that it's because you're dying and they will send staff up, and this happened to me on my honeymoon.
You can't change others, they have to want to change. But that said, I think some things are contagious, like curiosity and enthusiasm, passion is contagious.
Life is a verb, not a noun. The only way you can learn is by making a mistake.
What we're trying to do is sort of be a beacon for the most sort of curious and weird in a good way and high agency, optimistic.
I think we are the luckiest podcast that's on the air because our listeners are super interesting, super switched on people. Anybody can make the simple complex. It's much more effective if you can make the complex simple. Wow, Jim, you're so insightful. No. That's Ed William who is so insightful. I'm quite a good show horse, but a show horse without workhorses does not show very well. Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with an amazing accomplishment, if I do say so myself, the 200th episode of Infinite Loops. If I was a betting man, wait a minute, I am a betting man, I would have bet against me on this one. And really, the only reason that I'm actually doing this 200th podcast is because of the guys who are going to be shooting questions at me today. We have Ed William, the erstwhile inimitable researcher who makes me look smart. You guys, it's him. It's not me. So, wow, Jim, you're so insightful. No. That's Ed William who is so insightful. And our good friend Liberty, who is also the head of Infinite Media, who I will slip up and call by his actual Christian name throughout this. What are we doing here? What is this? Wait a minute. What's the deranged Biden? Like, where am I? I'm what? I'm the president of the United States? I'm the president of the United... How the fuck did that happen? Anyway, this is going to be a real challenge for me because literally the shoe is on the other foot. My hosts today are Michael, a.k.a. Liberty, and Ed William. Guys, welcome.
Good to be here.
It's a major milestone, right? 200. Like most podcasts don't make it past maybe 15. So right there, there's over 200 hours of conversation of you. That's multiple audiobooks of material. It's going to be so easy to train an AI on your voice, Jim. But today what we want to do is flip the script. We're the captain now. It reminds me of the scene in Blade Runner when they do the void caps test, right? They interview people, try to figure out if they're replicants. We want to know if we're talking to the real Jim or if this is the simulation, the AI. If today is the real Jim, I'm pretty sure that episode 300 is going to be the AI.
But
for today we have a... Oh, yeah, for sure. Maybe before then. 350. We have a bunch of questions for you. And then later we have questions from the listeners that we got off Twitter. But to begin, I'm going to add it up over to Ed. And let's see if we're talking to AI Jim today.
And as we said before we started recording, you're going to really try to get me on this one, I hope. Like,
oh, for sure.
I will be canceled by my own teammates.
This is the Frost Nixon of 2024.
When a president does something, it's not criminal. Really, Richard?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay then. So let's go. So we started. I look back at our previous episodes to some prep for this, and the very first episode was with Rank Capital and Super Mugati in November the 25th, 2019. So 4 years ago. So since then, we've had a pandemic, president. What else have we had? We've had COVID. You've started a company. You've sold a company. So it's been a big 4 years. Looking back to the very first episode, so November 2019, if we'd said to you then, what would the podcast look like in 4 years' time? What do you reckon you'd say?
this is going to sound contrived, but I would probably say it would look exactly like it looks right now. Because essentially, as you guys know, my son Patrick is the real podcast king. And he was really hitting it with on all cylinders with Invest Like the Best. And a guy who worked for me at OSAM, Jamie Catherwood, came into my office and he's like, Jim, you should have a podcast. And I looked at him and I went, Jamie, do you not understand something? Like, no fucking way. Why would I do that? I don't want to have to like prepare and get guests and do all that kind of stuff. He goes, I'll do it all. And I'm like, wait a minute, you'll do everything. And he goes, yep, I will do everything. And I will get the guests. I will do the research for you. All you got to do is show up. Literally all you got to do is show up. And I was very suspicious. And so I said, okay, we'll do a couple. We had done a podcast for the company called What Works on Wall Street, where we would talk about various investment factors, et cetera. But then I decided, okay, well, if we're going to do it, let's at least have some fun and make the first one two of the more entertaining parody accounts on Twitter. And then, of course, I did the interview in person. So that was another big change. All podcasts were done in person back then. And it was hysterical because Ramp literally got drunk. He was on vacation. We were at a club in Manhattan, and jokingly, when they came in to ask him what he wanted, he said, "You got any White Claw?" And they're like, "No." And I knew that Ramp was a fan of tequila, so I said to the wait person, "Listen, bring him like a flight of the various tequilas." And they did. and he literally, as the show goes on, gets drunker and drunker and drunker. Now,
I think we should bring that back.
Yeah, I know. You're absolutely
Where's my
right.
tequila?
Yeah, exactly. I like this.
We just started. We've already failed. I should have sent big bottles of tequila to all you guys. Anyway, at the same time, Dan McMurtry, who was Super Mugatu, had been a parody fun account, but then he doxed himself like a week prior to the episode. And I called him up, and we're OSB as investors in his anchorless Bangladesh fund. And I'm like, Dan, what the fuck? You've just totally ruined my game here. Anyway, we had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it because, back to your question, Ed, I thought, well, maybe there is room for a podcast that like really literally, almost literally breaks all the rules. Let's just make it completely conversational. I know, Michael, you've probably seen My Dinner with Andre. Ed, you're too young. But there was this great movie, My Dinner with Andre, with Wallace Shawn, who, interestingly enough, was the son of the legendary New Yorker editor. And anyway, it's just two guys talking. And you when you start the movie, you're kind of like, is this going to like go anywhere? And then it just ends up you're a fly on the wall listening to this incredible conversation. And that's kind of what I was aiming for with the pod.
And when you mentioned that you wouldn't be surprised by the format, like I listened back to the first few episodes to refresh my memory. And the first one is like very, very different, right? Tequila and jokes and everybody in the same room. In it, you mentioned that you don't like doing remote podcasts. So this is, I guess, something that changed. But like Ina's mentioned in the first episode, you say the phrase fiercely anti-authoritarian. Like there's already the seed of many of the best of, right? But by episode number 2 with Jim Chanos, like the format is almost fully formed. Like the only thing missing, I think, is the Emperor of the World question at the end. Like you, in episode number 2, you say we are very simpatico. Like it feels like it could be a recent episode. So that's my next question, right? Was the format something that like you sat down and you thought of it? And maybe it is Dinner with Andre or some inspiration, right? With Vicini from The Princess Bride. Or is this just, did it happen organically because that's your personality, right? You just went with like what feels natural. And then from episode number 2, basically, it's been the modern format.
Yeah. I intentionally, when I decided we were going to continue to do it, I'm like, okay, complex adaptive systems, all emergence comes from below, not above. I wanted it to kind of look the anti, I hate those lists the listicles that all of the grifters what 10 things does every millionaire do every morning? Right. And I didn't, and there was a bunch of interest in podcasts at the time. And so there were endless lists. They're like, no, you can't do this. You've got to do it this way. You've got to follow this script. And I'm like, fuck this. I'm not going to do. In fact, I actually, much to Jamie Catherwood's consternation, I kind of went the other way on everything on those lists. and so, yeah, I thought it emerged pretty quickly, as you say, Michael, in the second episode, the way I wanted it to be. And, I had no idea how I was going to do it. And the other thing I wanted to do was just make sure, and said intentionally, I will never monetize this podcast. And which for a lover of free market seems like a contradiction. But that wasn't the intention. The intention was, look, I think my purpose in life is to be useful. And I wanted to have really interesting people, specifically to, I try to look for, as you guys both know, I try to look for really, really interesting people who maybe haven't been on 100 podcasts already, and raise them above the radar, so to speak. So yeah, it kind of just came directly out, almost fully formed. I didn't really think, honestly, other than my dinner with Andrea, I really didn't think about it too much.
Do you think if you had decided early on to monetize it, your approach, we'd be sitting here doing a very different podcast today? If at all, maybe that would have meant you got bored of it.
That's a great question. I probably, by the way, that's another one. We should just edit that out. That's a great question, Ed. It's one of those verbal tics that, like, if you do a lot of these,
gives you
just
time
like,
to think, right?
Wow, That's a great question. How the fuck am I going to come up with an answer? And
no, but now we have to keep it because you did all this stuff with it.
Yeah, exactly.
So how would it differ if it was monetized? Well, as you guys know, I am very empirically oriented, and I would have A/B tested the hell out of it. And I would have probably stopped doing it, to be honest, because one of the things I've been experimenting with is taking transcripts. So, for example, I've done a bunch of shows with Alex Danko, who I think is a brilliant guy, and he's funny, and we love to talk to each other. And in the back of my mind, when we did, I think, the third or fourth one, I'm like, we should do a book. We should literally see whether, out of our kind of chaotic, one of the things with me and Alex was we literally never, ever covered the points that I told him to prepare for. In fact, one, I was rushed and I had a business thing going on. And so I didn't have any time to prepare for Alex's podcast. And so literally I took the questions that I had generated, or that Jamie had generated for the previous guest, and asked them to Alex. So anyway, I've been experimenting with playing around with ChatGPT, and it's pretty cool. I fed, I think, 6 or 5 full transcripts from the podcasts in. And then you ask it questions like, why is Jim such an idiot? What could Jim do better? What could Alex do better? Really cool. And actually, in that capacity, I probably will make a couple of changes. But like the pure mercantile A/B test, fine tune it, get it to be, just what everybody loved. That was not my goal. The TAM I'm looking for here is really small, to be honest. I'm looking for people who are just sort of really, really interested in honestly, the same things I'm interested in. And if I can be useful and have really cool guests on and serve that much smaller audience, I'm absolutely fine with that.
Yeah, I think I can't speak for others, but to me, what makes the podcast special as a listener is how authentic it is to you and your interests. And it's differentiated because you're not taking the same playlist that everybody else is, right? If everybody's optimizing for growth hacking and monetization, and they look at who's doing it, and they're all trying to sound like Joe Rogan or whatever, they all kind of like have the same format and the same template and get the same guests over time. And some of them can be really good at that formula, but it's less differentiated. While what you do is like, I don't know any other podcast with the same types of guests and the breadth of topics and all of that. So that, to me, that I think you organically stumble into a very, very interesting format. And one thing that I wonder about is, like, I understand how all these creative projects are always, there's a honeymoon phase at the beginning, right? It's new, it's exciting, it's like plenty of motivation. I'm curious how 200 episodes in, like, what has doing all of this taught you about, like, perseverance and iteration and like sticking to it? And like, has it ever felt challenging, or is it like still pure joy and just fun? Have you ever felt like stopping the podcast, right? Because these things ebb and flow. Has there ever been a kind of a down cycle where you're like, why am I doing this? Or I'm curious, have you ever had any doubts about it?
Actually, no, because as you say, in many respects, this is a very indulgent and selfish thing I'm doing. Honestly, I'm having people on who I want to talk to, and the assumption is there's got to be a reasonable size audience that are going to be interested in those same topics and those people. Persistence, I'm very lucky. I'm a very persistent person, and iteration. That is how you succeed at things in life, not just business, not just podcasts. You can't ever think that anything is really fully cooked, right? You've always got to be looking for, okay, how can I make this better? Or am I doing something right now that if I removed it would make it better? So kind of via negativity. And so no, I mean, like honestly, Michael, I would be doing this just on my own. Basically what you're seeing, and that's why it's so much fun for me. I would be doing this if I wasn't pressing publish. And
I can confirm, right? Because our private calls are pretty much podcasts, right? They're pretty much the same as when you're on a podcast. So you're always like this.
Yeah. Well, and actually, what example of that, Jim, is the episode that it's coming out. Well, when this gets released, it would have been released about 3 weeks ago with Guy Spear. The first 40 minutes of your conversation, Guy thought it was being recorded. Well, sorry, Guy thought it was being recorded, and Guy thought it was going to be released. And then Jim says about 40 minutes in, okay, shall we get going? And Guy says, I thought this was all for the podcast. And Jim was like, I know. But Guy was like, okay, well, let's release it. And I think actually when you listen to the episode, you don't notice any difference between the before and after. The way Jim has approached it has been exactly the same, which sort of speaks to what you're talking about.
And Guy is a very fascinating person. He's super smart, a really well-known value investor. And if you, Michael, you probably don't because you haven't seen the transcript, but we talk very, very little about investing and or the investing process. And we talk about things like psychedelics and, points of view and why you do this particular way. And he's got a super interesting backstory about how he really changed everything up after his lunch with Warren Buffett. He was one of the early purchasers. Again, a value investor. Cost a lot less when Guy bought his lunch than it costs these days. And I was kind of like, well, fuck it. Because Guy was great. Well, as you know, Ed, because you did all the heavy lifting. He's like, I give you permission to use everything I've already said. I'm like, okay, I guess we'll do it that way. So yeah, that's a great example of we had a wonderful conversation that I didn't think was going to be for publication. But then his little prompt, I give you permission to do the whole thing. I'm like, oh, we should do that then.
I mean, linked into the sort of the way that it's it's something you'd be doing even if it wasn't recorded and not wanting it to be advertised or monetized. What's your personal sort of metric as to what is a successful episode? What is it when you walk away from an episode and you're like, oh, that was a really good one? What is it? What are the signals? What are the things that excite you about it?
Well, I'll use George Mack's example. One of his maxims is that you can tell whether somebody, a friend or a colleague, is going to be good for you by how do you feel after you leave a conversation or an exchange with that person? Do you feel like you want to jump on a treadmill and you're filled with energy, or do you feel like, oh shit, I got to lie on the couch, that was so draining? And so one of the immediate things that I know right away is by that, how I feel after I've done the podcast. If and my wife, my long suffering wife, it if I'm really charged up, I'll go and say, I just had the most fascinating conversation, with Mr. or Ms. XYZ. And she's like, okay, stop. Because I don't need a soliloquy. And then, if I'm feeling like, yeah, I guess that was okay, it's probably not going to be one of the more popular ones, because that's the other thing that I find really interesting. So for example, a really good example is Brian Marescu, who wrote the book, The Religion with No Name. And it's about this. I mean, I love this. He is a great example of the type of guest that I love, right? So he got a degree, I think, from Brown in ancient languages. So he spoke ancient Greek, he spoke or could read Sanskrit, and then went on to be a lawyer. This will resonate with you. He was incredibly bored by being a lawyer, and his love was antiquity and trying to figure things out. And so he left the law and did this huge research project, which basically his thesis was, the ancient Greek cults of the earliest part of Greek history were very, very popular. And his guess was that they were using psychedelics. And so, literally, that was the theme of his book. And we had this just a wonderful conversation. And then afterwards, I'm like, yeah, this is going to get 2, maybe 3 listeners, because, we're talking about a very esoteric book and a very esoteric subject. It turned out to be a super popular podcast. So I'm not always right, obviously. Something that I find super exciting, others apparently don't. But as you also know, I literally, and Ed, you can swear to this, I have no idea how many listeners any particular podcast. I never ask you. And if you remember why, I'm a very competitive person still. And if I got that data, and let's take Brian. If I learned that episode didn't get any listeners, I probably, even unconsciously, would have stopped asking people like him on the podcast. And I didn't want that to happen. So I literally have no idea about our metrics. I have no idea about, when we hit 1 million downloads, the first I learned about it was on Twitter, when I think Batzel published, hey, 1 million downloads. I'm like, wow.
The last to know.
Amazing. That's incredible. But I really didn't want to sway my own behavior. And that's why I still don't look at any of the metrics or numbers, because that isn't why I'm doing this.
I re-listened to that episode with Brian to prepare for this, and I'm going to plug it. I'm going to second what you said and encourage readers to listeners. I'm used to readers. I encourage listeners to go check it out. It's episode 57. And one of the highlights in it for me was something that I find very, very important. It's how things can have the same name but be different things, right? And so in finance, you could say, oh, the S&P did that this year, and 50 years ago was totally different companies, right? So same name, different thing. And the episode, he mentions how, like, in the Bible or ancient documents, they mention, like, oh, they drank wine. But modern wine and this wine could have been totally different, right? It could have been mushrooms and all kinds of things that lead to a very different experience. So this was eye-opening and something to remember when you're thinking about something. It's not because the new Star Wars film has the Star Wars name that it's going to be as good as the old one, right? Anyway, that's an aside. And I can also totally relate to your heuristic for good conversation, right? Like every time I talk to David Senra, I feel like I've had 5 cups of espresso. I want to be better. I want to work harder on my project, right? Some people just fire you up that way. And listening to the podcast, you can feel it as a listener. The fly on the wall effect that you talked about, it really works. And I think that's what the best episodes really have. It's like they just fire you up to do better in your own life.
Yeah. And David, I love David. Patrick Colossus is the one that is the company David's podcast is attached to. And he's been here at the house several times. And the guy is literally, he is what you see is absolutely David. As a matter of fact, I joked when he was here, like the first thing, I have a library, and first thing David does is come, ignore me entirely. This is the first time he's visiting me at this house, and spends like 15 minutes looking at all the books. And he starts pulling them out and saying, this one's good. This one's good. I'm like, you are a maniac. And that's why he's so successful, right? I mean, like, be authentic, be distinctive, follow what you really love in a way that, maybe other people are just not going to be able to match that, right? And those kind of 3 things David brings to every one of his episodes. The guy I love him.
Yeah, it's the novel thing about, like, find something that to you is play and others is work, right? If you can fake passion for a little bit, but over years and years you can't, right? And it's the people who, like, think about that 24/7 that get the farthest ahead. Getting back to questions, because this could easily be a 5-hour episode, but we're gonna try. We're gonna try very hard. One question I had for you is, do you ever get nervous before recording an episode? Because you don't look like you would, but you never know what's going on inside other people. I don't know if you had so much experience with public speaking, or, like, I'm curious, what's your relationship with, like, being recorded like this, speaking in public?
So I very rarely get nervous, but I think that is because of repetition. I basically, I owe a big part of my career to the legacy media. I know that's kind of ironic.
Your favorite people.
Given the fact, but like I, for a long time in the late 90s, I was the co-host of Squawk Box when it was still a good show, and had Mark Haynes, and it was a 3-hour format, and the co-host basically was there for the full 3 hours. And so I just got very used to being on TV. And speeches, same thing. I think I've literally given thousands of speeches, and to audiences from anywhere from a dozen to over 15,000. And the thing that I do notice, actually, my wife pointed it out. I didn't notice it, so let's give her the credit. I get, I think, a little excited, and maybe you could equate that with nervous right before, especially on like live speeches. I have found that if I don't have nervous energy, and with me, it's me popping my leg up and down. If I don't have that, I'm much worse. And so what I've found is, and it hits like literally 5 minutes before I go on. And it's not nervous, like my mouth doesn't get dry and like that, but I just kind of like, I get this nervous energy. And then if that's there, the speech is usually, or the podcast is usually good. If that's not there, I bomb. And that's the other thing. Like, as you know, and I always like to illustrate it with Jerry Seinfeld's wonderful joke. Fear of public speaking is the number one fear in North America. And then Jerry was like, that means that if you're at a funeral, you would rather be in the box than doing the eulogy. and so it beats out fear of death. And so I think that's why so many people get nervous and whatnot. Now, to be completely transparent, the first time I was on CNBC, I was scared shitless. I was like 34 years old, and Mark Haynes, I'd watched for years and years and years. I knew he would ask tough questions, etc. And so Ron Howard, the director, is a friend of mine, and I was at his house, and I'm like, Ron, like, I've never been on live TV. What, do you have any hints? And he gave me two great notes. He was like, number one, when you're sitting on the set, there are going to be monitors on either side of you that show what the camera is seeing. So in other words, they're going to show you or your host. And he goes, do not look at them. And I'm like, why? And he did this.
Right.
What I'm doing is, for listeners instead of watchers, I'm doing the looking to the side. And he goes, and that makes you look shifty. And so that was like really good advice. And then he said, you are only talking to your conversant. Forget the cameras. Forget that anyone else is watching. Because one of the things that works you up is like millions of people are going to see this. And it's live. Oh my God, what if I fuck up? What if I say something wrong? What, and so your brain goes through those things. If, on the other hand, I'm just chatting with Mark, it's like you and me, Michael, or you and me talking. It does a really great job of just reducing any kind of nerves that you might have at all.
Yeah. Do you know if your first appearance is on YouTube? Have you ever rewatched it? Your first time on TV?
Oh, yeah, I have. We lost it. We moved recently, and we had my wife again, thank God, is very organized, whereas I am a chaotic attractor. And so one of the things that she used to do was videotape all of my appearances. And before the move, I did find one which was actually pre-CNBC. It was for my first book, Invest Like the Best. And I was doing it. This dates me, of course. But back then, there was a ton of local, like, basic cable broadcasts. And so I got on one. That it was horrible.
Did you have a brown tweed jacket?
No, I didn't. I mean, we've come a long way, guys. We've come a very long way. Basic cable, if you remember Wayne's World,
Yes.
that made it look very glamorous. It was not glamorous. But then I also watched the first time I was on CNBC. And yeah, I think I've gotten better. The funniest one, I think, was when I was on Oprah Winfrey for my book, How to Retire Rich. And literally, so first off, what a head trip that was. I don't watch a lot of TV. So I got invited on Oprah without ever having seen an Oprah Winfrey show. And so I had extra time when I was in Chicago to film the live episode. And I thought, you know what? I should probably maybe watch like her show and see what it's like. And so I watched the show and I'm like, oh, I've made a terrible mistake.
Oh, shit.
So, but then I go and it's like the green room, Colin Powell is in the green room and I get an opportunity to have a conversation with him. That's another thing that I'm very lucky to be blessed with. I will approach anyone and ask them questions and all that sort. So immediately we shake hands. I'm talking to him. I had great admiration for him at that time. He sullied that a little bit with his whole speech at the UN about weapons of mass destruction. But I still think, I mean, he's a very accomplished, incredible guy. And so I walk up, introduce myself, and my first question is, why don't you run for president? I said, like, this country really, it would be great if we had a black president, and you seem to be the natural. Why aren't you doing that? And he got this huge smile on his face and laughed, and he goes, basically because my wife would kill me. Oh, well, then he paused. He goes, actually, my wife would divorce me, then kill me. But and that's why I don't do it. So I had this so that loosened things up, right? And I'm like, okay, generally speaking, What Works on Wall Street, very technical book, as you guys both know. And so back then it was a live show. And the area, the hallway from the green room to the set was literally blacked out, because they didn't want light getting onto the set again for a live show. And most of Oprah's producers are women. And so I'm standing there and I'm surrounded, literally, I think 7 women. And they're all talking to me at once. Like, you're going to be great. You're going to be really good. You're going to be really great. And then I get this tug on my sleeve, and I look over. I can't see who was doing it. And there's a young woman there, and she's like, Jim, just one last tip. And I'm like, okay, what? And she goes, try not to say anything too technical when you're chatting with Oprah. And I'm like, could you give me an example of what you would consider technical? And she goes, yeah, don't like use terms like the Dow Jones Industrial Average. I'm like,
ooh, very technical.
I'm like, I am.
Let's talk about finance, but you can't mention finance, right?
Right. And so I'm like, okay, holy shit. Oprah, of course, has never read the book. She, like me, Oprah had the staff doing all the research, and like I'm thinking, okay, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And so I go out there. It's during a commercial break, which was great, because I sit down, meet Oprah. How are you? Nice to meet you. Blah blah blah. And so she looks at me. She's holding the book, and she's like, and she looks at me. And she goes, "So what's this about?" And the book is How to Retire Rich. And I'm like, well, the title is rather self-explanatory. No, she was like, what's the main message you want people to take away from this book? And that's when I came up with with what we titled a piece that I wrote. If you can change your focus, you can change your future. And Oprah lit up. And she goes, I love that. And so when the cameras came on, Oprah's got this big smile, and she's got the book, and she's like endorsing me.
She loves like, you.
My next guest just told me one of the most wonderful things in the world. And so, but you never know, right? Like I have probably every fuck up that you can do on a live set or a live stage, I have done with learnings from it. Like if anyone listening or watching wants a tip, if you're about to give a speech to 10,000 people and you need to use the washroom, turn your mic off. That's a good idea.
It's like in The Naked Gun.
Another one I learned, thank God it wasn't me, it was the guy who went on before me. Don't get drunk before you're giving a speech to like 5,000 people. And literally this guy, and I think later we learned it was nerves, and he maybe overdid it a little. And I'm like, yeah, so no drinking, shut off the mic before going in to take a pee. Thank God it was just number one, right? But anyway.
So we're canceling the tequila now.
Yeah. Sadly. By the way, Ramp was the only one who had any of the tequila because he was literally on vacation. He didn't have to do any work or anything else. And so the rest of us remained water or tea people.
It's funny, this is a bit of a tangent, but what you were saying about not looking side to side, not looking shifty on the camera. obviously that's like the trademark example of that is Nixon against Kennedy when they had their first televised interview. And then I realized actually the guy who gave you that advice was Ron Howard, who I think directed Frost Nixon, didn't he? So yeah, it's quite funny little circularity there. A question I had, I was looking back through the episodes, and two ones which stood out to me were Brian Rammel's first episode, because I think around then you picked up the concept of human OS. It'd been something you'd been talking about previously in an abstract sense, but I think you got the term human OS from Brian. And then also Will Stall's episode about status, because again, it's something you've been talking about before, but I feel like speaking to Brian and then speaking to Will gave you sort of a framework for how to articulate those concepts. And I feel like you refer to that quite a lot now. And I was wondering whether there's any other episodes that sort of stand out to you when you look back as ones that are either have changed the way you think about the world or have helped you articulate something you were thinking previously, or just stand out as particularly memorable.
So first off, I steal broadly. And I think that's kind of funny with all of these lawsuits currently being brought against model training artificial intelligence companies. So when Brian used human OS, I was like, oh, I fucking love that. And in a subsequent conversation, he was funny. He goes, I've been using human OS for decades. And he goes, now everybody associates it with you. And I'm like, Brian, I can point you to all of the original disclosures that I stole from that. I stole that from you. And he started laughing because he's an amazing guy. He's like, no, steal away. I love it. And I guess the episodes that stand out for me, well, a classic one, David Roney. So I didn't know David at all. And so we wanted to experiment, as you guys both know, but many of our listeners and viewers might not know. I'm a big believer in crawl, walk, run, meaning, I want to try to figure something out. Let's just try. You got to do something, right? So crawl. And this is back when the Bored Apes were so big with NFTs. And I'm like, this just doesn't make any sense to me at all. And so I started doing research on NFTs, non-fungible tokens. And so I thought, you know what? Fuck it. Let's just do one and see what happens. And so I started talking to people who knew a lot about NFTs. And the one thing I took away from most of those conversations was this concept that an NFT can't be just a JPEG. It's got to be something that unlocks something else, right? So we decided, okay, we'll sell this NFT, and it will unlock an appearance on Infinite Loops. You could either co-host or you could be the guest. And it was wild. Batzel, another one of our colleagues who was doing your job then, Ed, was just like kind of watching the auction of the NFT, and all of a sudden it just exploded upwards. And it ended up going for, I can't remember what the parity rate was back then, but for the Ethereum equivalent of 40,000 US. And so I was like, wow, that's incredible. But the guy who bought it was a very successful immigrant in Silicon Valley. And one of his things was, paying it forward. And so when we contacted him, he's like, my objective is to take somebody who I think is below the radar, who really should be above the radar. And the guy I want you to have on is David Roney. And I'm like, okay, fine. And so we did some research on him, interesting guy. And then throughout the podcast, I became more like, again, if you're watching, you'll see me opening my mouth like jaw dropping down on the floor. Like, how the fuck did this guy manage to do what he did? And so at the end of the podcast, after I shut the recording off, I looked at David, and I was still at OSAM at the time. We sold it, and I knew that I was going to be forming OSV. But David didn't know that. And so I'm like, hey, David, would you let me make a movie about you? And like the look on his face was like, so I'm sorry, aren't you like a quant asset manager? And now you want to make a movie? And I'm like, yeah. And so I explained to him what was happening. And he's like, yeah, I don't think so. And anything. And you guys also know that another part of my persistence is to continually reframe something until the person is like, oh, all right,
framing, yeah.
just stop bugging me. Okay, you can make a fucking movie about me. But so that one springs to mind as I kind of went into that podcast knowing and being impressed by David's accomplishments, which are innumerable, Ed, you know, because you're writing the book about him. But the podcast itself, by the end of it, like I had no plan to say to David, will you let me make a movie about you? And so that was a major impact for me, at least. And then you bring up Brian Romelli. That was another one where like I learned of Brian on Twitter, and he's just a really fascinating guy. And at that time, he was talking about the intelligence amplifier and the memory keeper and all these things. And literally by the end of the episode, after we shut the mics off again, I'm like, will you let me invest in your company? I will invest in your company. I want a intelligence amplifier. I will buy it. You can name the price. Tell me. And now we're actually hiring Brian as a consultant for the AI part of our various verticals. So yeah, very, very, very impactful. And then finally, probably the other one that affected me in a not great way was the more recent one that we did on fentanyl, the fentanyl crisis. And like I honestly, I thought I knew how bad that was and everything else. And then as I was having the discussion about it with the author, I'm like, oh my God, like this is horrible. So yeah. And those are what are just springing to mind right now. Again, one of my signature moves is to not prepare for anything. And so as I told you guys before we started recording, I have no idea what you're going to ask me. I did zero preparation. So let's have fun. But those are the ones that spring immediately to mind.
This is a perfect segue. But before I want to mention that the fentanyl episode is episode 189 with Ben Westhoff, and I recommend it. And he wrote a book about it. He went undercover in China, posing as a buyer of fentanyl and the precursors, and he got tours of like the fentanyl factories and everything. He's a great investigative journalist, and so I recommend the episode and his work. But speaking of preparation, right? I want to talk about a very important behind-the-scenes contributor. And now we have to pretend that Ed is not on the call, right? So it's just between you and I, Jim. Yeah. I'd love it if you could talk about your experience of like working with Ed and his contributions and everything, because I think most listeners benefit a lot from his work, but they may not know all about it. So I think it's good to put a spotlight on him.
Totally. Ed is an amazing researcher. He does some of the most thorough research backgrounders for me before I have a guest on. And they're so good that we publish them at the Substack. And I've gotten feedback and Ed's gotten it directly. Like some people will email me saying, that is the best distillation of my views and my work that I've ever seen. And so I'm really not kidding, listeners and viewers, when I say when you think, oh God, Jim is so fucking smart. No, actually, Ed is so fucking smart and really, really good at distilling big bodies of work. Okay, so we're not talking about like Ed finds everything. And I've had innumerable times when I'll make a reference and the guest will go, how did you find that? Like, I don't even remember writing that. And so I think that literally we would not be doing a 200 episode. Yeah. Did I just let the cat out of the bag about all of my longevity hacks that I have a
The
flight
serum
to
is finally working, Jim. The
I
serum-
have a flight booked to Switzerland for a particular clinic visit right after this. No, kidding. And Batzel before him, and Jamie. The people don't really get. It's like I often joke, you're either a show horse or a workhorse, and being the diva that I am, I'm quite a good show horse. But a show horse without workhorses does not show very well, does not place, win, or show without people doing the deep work. So, I mean, Ed, as you know, you have been invaluable to making me sound smart, which I very much appreciate.
Well, thank you. I'm going red. I'm going to blend in with my orange wall behind me. Thinking about the future rather than the past. What would be your dream 3 guests? We didn't tell you were going to ask this. 3 guests have to be living. Other than that, no limits. Other than David Deutsch is a given. He's in the bag. You can't select him.
You took my first one out of the.
harder.
I wanted to do a quick call out to the people listening. If anyone can get us David Deutsch, then I can't express the not to speak for Jim, but Jim's gratitude and ours as well. He's been a target of ours for a while. So yeah, it'd be great to have on the pod. But anyway, Jim, 3 guests.
Yeah. Okay. So do I get to count him as one? So I have to give 2 more, because that was going to be my first. That was going to be my
2 more.
That was going to be my first answer. Okay. And they have to be living. That really
They do
sucks.
have to be alive. Yeah.
Because
But maybe do a dead one after as well, because that would be fun.
Yeah, well, what we would do is we would train up an AI on all of their published work, and then we would create a sim of them, and we would have them on. I actually want to do that. Let's see. I think that I would love to have somebody like Elon Musk. I would love to have him on, because I would have, I think, maybe I'm deluding myself here, but I would have, I think, a very different conversation with him than most of the pieces of his that I have seen. I think I have no dog in the Elon Musk hunt, right? Does he do crazy ass shit all the time? I mean, and is he intentionally being a lightning rod? I kind of think he is. I kind of think that a lot of what he's doing is very, very calculated. Like telling Bob Iger to go fuck himself.
Yeah.
And so he fascinates me because he's such a complex person that I'm not endorsing him and I'm not damning him here. I'm just saying, when everyone was going on, Twitter's dead, we're going to go to Blue Sky, or we're going to go to, whatever, Discord, and this is awful. And then you just watch him literally do things like community notes and allowing a lot more free speech than the old regime allowed. But that's I think that's a side project for him. If you took the controversial lightning rod away and you said, what would you think of somebody who started not 1, but 2 transformational companies? What would you say about a guy who manages to launch and land rockets in a very, very predictable way? What would you say about somebody who had an electric car company that has a 0 marketing budget and dominates, I think, still, I could be wrong about this, so fact check me. I don't know if one of the big automakers is outselling Tesla with their electric things.
No, and the Model Y is currently the best-selling vehicle in the world.
Well, there you go. I didn't know that, right? And so
but they have very few models. All of their sales are basically 2 models, while Toyota has maybe 25 models. So it's not quite apples to apples, but still very successful.
So what would you say about somebody who did that and it wasn't this divisive character that Elon, I think, plays? I think that's the other thing. I mean,
He knows what he's doing.
like maybe one of the first questions I would ask him is, so why did you write this role for yourself? Why did you decide this was the way you were going to break through? Because he's obviously a brilliant dude. And I don't know how you can't have admiration for somebody who is pushing society forward into space, into non-gas based vehicles, etc. So I would love, and I'll never get, obviously, because like, who the fuck are you, mate? Like, no, get out of here. And then I think I would love to have on. I'm trying to think of somebody who I think super highly of, but they're incredibly controversial.
Even a question on that: why controversial? What's that element of it? Just because you think that would make for a more interesting conversation, or?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, for example, I love Kevin Kelly. Great example.
Is it? Yeah,
I've read all of his books, and I think he's brilliant, and I think that he's a great thinker, etc. But we had the opportunity to have him on the podcast, and by the time it got to us, there'd already been like, Michael, you did a great podcast with it.
Thank you.
And so I kind of pulled the invite because it was not because I don't admire him greatly. I do. As I say, I own all of his books. I think he's a great thinker. But like, okay, he's not terribly controversial, at least not to me. And there were so many other people talking to him on this book. And I'm kind of like, I'm not going to be able to do anything interesting here because, especially after you, goddammit, Michael, you asked him some really great
it's
questions.
on my phone now.
But why controversial? Because I'm, there's the GIF I use a lot, do not push button. And it's the guy from Family Guy. And it's just him pushing the button. But like, I'm like that in real life. If it says do not push, I push. If it says do not pull this thing when you're in Europe and in the bathroom, well, I wonder what this is for. I learned that it's because you're dying and they will send staff up. And this happened to me on my honeymoon in a German-speaking country. And they kept, because I kept pulling the thing in the shower. And my wife finally came into the bathroom and she goes, "Are you doing something in here?" And I'm like, "No." Why do you ask? Because, it's the Germans with efficiency. You think your husband might be dying in the bathroom. Let us go in. And I just think that makes it more fun, right? Okay. And I'm very interested in the tales. And you've got to get very used to neuroatypical people. And I think that there's a lot of fascination there, and that's why kind of controversial.
I'm going to try to reframe that through one of our common heroes, right? So Claude Shannon's information theory says that like true information is basically surprising. And I think you're looking for some of that in your guests. If it's someone you love, but you agree with them on everything and everybody else agrees with them on everything, it can be a very nice conversation, a nice love fest, but there's less information.
100% true. And the idea that I have is that's boring, right? Like if everybody loves you, nobody loves you. Let's be really honest here. You've got to, you're not going to be distinctive at all if you're just simply parroting the maxims or truisms of your tribe. And Claude Shannon, hero of mine, for all of the reasons you mentioned, and that unlock. What is information? Information is novel. And so I think it was Shannon, might have been somebody else, who said there is zero information in a political stump speech, right? and there can be tons of information in a new poem. And so, that's kind of one of my missions, right? In addition to trying to be useful, is to highlight those things and find the new information, because that's what's interesting. That's what's exciting. It's like I can't imagine just consuming or reading or watching or whatever viewpoints that I just already agree with. Like, it might make you feel good, I guess, but I just think it's a waste of time. So it's kind of like, yeah, now I end up, because I say simpatico all the time, I think it's really funny that people like key in on that. But I end up having people on who I found fascinating and often agree with at the end of our conversation. But again, that's also part of the unscripted nature of the show. In the early days, I had one guest who shall remain nameless, who was like really freaked out that I did not send him a set of questions ahead of time. And he was an old-handed podcast and everything else, and that's the old media model, right? So when I used to do CNBC Squawk Box all the time, I got several days before, here are the questions, here are the here's what we're going to ask you, all of that, and that leaves very little room for surprise. It's just like one big public relations circle jerk, in my opinion. And so back to Frost Nixon, right? Like the reason I think Ron's movie works so well, by the way, little known fact, because I had the privilege of seeing it in its rough cut. Ron often has friends over to watch his movies in a rough cut and criticize them. The soundtrack that he had but could not come close to affording for the film was like the greatest rock and roll from that era. And like the first thing, we're at his house and he's got a movie theater there, and like the first thing everyone said was, dude, the movie was great, but that soundtrack, you're going to make a fortune on that. And he started laughing. He goes, none of those songs are we going to be able to afford. But why did that work, right? Why was that fascinating in the real Frost Nixon and then in his movie? It worked because he got Nixon. Nixon, kind of the master politician who, was going to have an answer for everything. Frost was able to tease out of him all those things that Nixon absolutely did not want to say. And so I that's interesting. There's your drama. There's your holy shit. Did he really just? And I actually watched when I was nerd alert. I watched the actual Frost Nixon interviews when the real ones, and thought I loved that movie. That's one of my favorite movies of Brown's.
Very quickly, my favorite bit in that film is when Frost has come. I think it's the second interview, which doesn't go so well for Frost, and then right at the beginning, they're doing all the pleasantries. Then Nixon just leans to him and says something like, "Did you have sex with your wife last night?" or something like that. He asks him a really inappropriate question, and then straight away they're into it, and it's such a cool thing because you can see he's just like, it's this little way of just unsettling him before the interview. It's clever.
And I've studied all that kind of stuff, and like there are a lot of ways you can do shit like that, and it does not surprise me that Richard Nixon did them all. Like I personally think this is probably a minority opinion, but a lot of people say that Trump was the craziest president that the United States ever had. Does not hold a candle to Richard Nixon. That guy was batshit crazy. And if you read, like, he was also often quite intoxicated and, like, holy shit, the not a terribly sane person. But I mean, look, he opened China. He reestablished, and that's another thing, by the way. Like, so many people make the mistake of, like, again, Musk, Nixon, Churchill, take your pick. These guys were not normal people. And it's kind of like, well, the Nixon, what a disgrace, what a horrible person. But you also still have to say, he did open China as only a Republican could do at that particular time. Churchill, I mean, like, he had depression that was so bad, he called it his black dog, and he did some pretty uncool things. But he also saved Britain through the power of words, right? And so these people are not normal people. And don't judge what somebody is saying or doing by what their personality type happens to be, right? That's like one of the biggest mistakes I think people make, which is why ad hominem arguments are basically the easiest for people to make. And you see it all the time on social media. You can tell almost instantly. In one of my experiments, I would say something about a slightly controversial person, and then you just see the tribes like, yeah, he's great, and blah, blah, blah. And, it's like, don't be an NPC. Don't just simply, I passionately believe that if you can infer all of my opinions about anything from one of my opinions, then I'm an NPC. Right. Yeah. I'm in an echo chamber. I don't think for myself. And so many people just go through life taking the shrink wrapped human OS that they were given when they were born. And I'm like, I'm fine with this. This is great. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go to which church am I going to? Which of these gods am I going to believe in? Thor. Okay. Go Thor. And there's just so much more richness and a richer tapestry to life if you're willing to just be open-minded about, it'd be pretty hard to figure out something nice to say about Hitler. Okay. but you get my meaning.
Yeah, there's controversial and then there's evil. Right. All the examples that you gave and the idea of being able to stay in the nuance zone, right? Seeing the good and the bad and not rejecting all of one or the other, right? Made me think about not maybe the perfect, but a good dead guest that would have been really fun to have on the show. Steve Jobs, right? Now that he's dead, he's Saint Steve Jobs and everybody loves him. But when he was alive, he was quite controversial. And the guy, he wasn't afraid of saying when something he thought was shit or someone was an idiot or he had strong opinions, right? So that I think that would have been a great episode in the same vein as what you were talking about with Elon Musk, right? Some of these people, they have very, very spiky personalities. They're not the average person. And that's why they can do amazing things on one side and sometimes where their life is falling apart on the other side. They're not balanced at all.
Yeah. And Jobs would be perfect. I love to go and ferret out original things that were written about people at the time. Yeah. And if you do that, Jobs was incredibly controversial. And there was no sort of deification of Steve Jobs other than by Steve Jobs himself when he was alive. Now, as he got sick and after turning Apple around and the iPhone and the iPod and all that kind of stuff, he was definitely refreshing his reputation. But if you read the biography about him, he was not a good person. I mean, at least by my lights. He treated his children like shit. He treated his wives or girlfriends horribly. He treated his staff horribly. And he was a sharp character. The one guy I was reading about, I can't remember the name of the company, but Apple was going to buy him. And everything had been signed. All the legal work had been done. And Jobs calls him to his office. And I can't remember the price. I think it was $250 million at the time. But Jobs looks at him and he goes, yeah, we're not paying you $250 million. And the guy's like, but. And Jobs is like, no, you decide before you walk out of this office whether you're going to accept, I think it was $175 million. And okay, wow, interesting. But, honestly, Warren Buffett, another favorite one of mine. I admire Warren Buffett, but not for the reasons that all the Buffett heads and the people who do their pilgrimage to Omaha every year. They're buying his carefully meticulously crafted persona of the old nice Midwestern
Avuncular,
Uncle
yeah,
Warren,
yeah.
avuncular Warren. That guy is a gangster, man. He has ice water in his veins. And yeah, he does these great deals because of his reputation. I call it the Buffett premium. He did, like, for example, Solomon Brothers was rocked by a treasury trading scandal. And literally only Warren Buffett could have saved them.
Yeah.
And so he exacted a huge pound of flesh and saved them. But it's that steel, it's that, OG aspect of Buffett that I love. And it's not the folksy ukulele playing, seas candy chopping, cherry Coke. That's so, to me, so obviously a persona. And I'm just kind of shocked that people don't understand that, can't see through that.
As well as 4 years of Infinite Loops, it's obviously been 4 years in your life. Quite a lot has happened. You've sold OSAM, you've launched OSV, you've had, and then another thing that's happened is you've had, how many grandchildren have you had in the last 4 years?
I have 5 grandchildren, and in the last 4 years, 3 of them
3
are new.
So you talked quite a lot across in Infinite Loops and on Twitter and with your conversations with other people about sort of your style as parents and the things you try to teach your kids and how you try to teach them. And I wondered whether there is a different approach to grandchildren, how it differs having grandchildren, and whether the way you interact with them and the way you try to teach them is different from the way you try to teach your children.
There's the great joke that my mom used to love that was, why do grandparents and grandchildren have such great relationships? And the answer is because they have a common enemy. and so I don't view it as my remit to train or teach my grandchildren. I think that's my son and daughter's jobs and their spouses. So it's actually lovely for me because I get this wonderful thing where I just get to enjoy them. And I guess if I'm having any input on them, it's just the conversations that I get to have especially with the older ones. I love talking to all of my grandchildren that can talk. I have 2 that can't. But my oldest actually is turning 10. And Pierce, he's Patrick's son. And I just have the best time with him because we now are at this stage where we can talk about things we're mutually interested in. So, for example, I love techno music, and he's an aspiring DJ. So our little thing is just shooting techno songs back and forth to each other, and talking about them and whatnot. But I think one of the things I was lucky to learn early in life was we all think that we are going to be able to mold and shape and craft our children to our desires. And that simply is not true. We don't come out with a blank slate. When we come out of the womb, it's not that our personalities are fully formed, they're not, but we have a tremendous amount of tendencies, I guess you could call them, already. And each one's kind of unique. And, once a child gets past puberty, they're far more influenced by their peer group than they are by their parents. And so when my wife and I chatted about it, it was like we decided we should have pretty simple objectives. And we alighted upon what we want to do is raise great adults. And so when you think about that, it's like, oh, okay, that sounds good. Well, it's very limiting, right? If you want to raise a great adult, you can't say, my house, my rules. You can't say, because I said so. You can't say, because I'm big and you're little. I'm smart and you're dumb. you have to not say any of those things. But also, like, you have to encourage them to find things on their own. Like, my kids would always I'm lucky to have a pretty good memory for anything I read. And so my kids try to use me as Google for their homework assignments. And they would be like, hey, Dad, what was the Treaty of Versailles and who's this Talleyrand guy? And I would simply say, look it up in there. And we had a huge library in the family room of our old house. They weren't happy about it then, but it's like you ask Patrick, Kate, or Lael, like, what was one of the things that they most admired about the way they were brought up? It was that. It was like, no, I'm not going to tell you. Go do it on your own, because that's how you stoke curiosity. That's how you, you guys both, though. You guys are both inveterate rabbit hole divers. When you're looking up who Talleyrand was, by the way, he was the French representative at the Congress of Vienna that ended the Napoleonic Wars, and he was a very witty guy. But so you're looking up Talleyrand, and then all of the other stuff that's included under Talleyrand, because hey, here's a guy who was an aristocrat, kept his head during the Reign of Terror. I mean,
which is nice, right?
Which is nice. That became very important to Napoleon as a French aristocrat from the Ancien regime, and then got picked to, okay, Napoleon lost. I got to go fix this. So a fascinating dude. But the idea that, treat them with respect, treat them like they have agency, treat them like what they think and do matters. And so I guess I treat my grandchildren the same way. So I guess I'm doing exactly the same thing, but in a very diminished capacity.
Looking back over 200 episodes, one thing we looked at is recurring guests. Number one, I think. Do you know who's the most recurring guest?
Alex Danko.
Yeah, Alex Danko with seven appearances. And then the next one below that is me, 4, and now this is 5. So Alex will have to come back to defend his title, catching up. And there's Rory Sutherland, Tom Morgan, common friend, Trump fan, common friend, Rob Anderson, and then many others with two appearances like Derek Sivers and many others. And one of the joke that Ed and I had before the recording this is almost every time at the end of a podcast, you mention, oh, you have to come back. We need to do part 2 because there's so much more we have to talk about. And it's such a nice part of the conversational format that this is an interview with a beginning and an end. It's a conversation and it's ongoing. And if you have a good rapport with someone and you have interest in common, like you can keep going on for as with Alex, right? 7 times. That's many hours of non-overlapping conversation. I think this is another rare thing, right? You don't see that very often with other podcasts. But my question for you, because this wasn't really a question, I'm curious, what would you want the listeners to the podcast to take from it, right? To take away? Like I can have a bunch of guesses because there are some recurring themes, right? Like open-mindedness and curiosity and agency and all that type of stuff. But like if you had to put it in your own words, right? What's the ideal listener like activation from listening to a lot of Infinite Loops?
So I think that they're already there. That's the problem with that question. I think that we are blessed to have an audience that is really switched on. They're very tuned in, and it becomes this virtuous flywheel, right? Where I get emails or texts from people all the time, like, "Hey, I listened to that. You should really have X on, or you should really talk to Y." So your network is your filter, and so we've got. I just think our audience is amazing, and so if it was somebody new or if it wasn't like naturally drawn to it, I would hope that what they take away is the world is a fantastic place. And is there bad in the world? Of course there's bad in the world. But right now we're safer than we've ever been. less people are in poverty than have ever in all of human history. Does that mean that we have to give up our efforts and not keep working at it? Of course not. But I look for things to root for, not against. And I would hope that my enthusiasm around things get other people like going, yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, we should do that. Yeah. and just realize that don't confine yourself into this tiny little box. We all have a variety of skills and deficiencies, right? Lean into your skills and explore and understand that there are a lot of really great things right now happening that I just feel like ridiculously blessed to be alive during this. And if we can get just one listener who was kind of meh about something to get really fired up about it, like that's exciting to me. And the David Roney is again back to his example. Like if we can get just a couple of young men in Oakland where David grew up to watch that movie and say, you know what? If he can do that, I can do it too. Right? Like Hollywood is just completely shitting the bed. And I don't know what kind of mind virus they have, but they don't make anything that is inspirational anymore. They don't make, for the most part, I'm making blanket statements, which I hate. For the most part, though, the inspirational kind of, wow, yeah, I can do that too, has gone away. And, infinite films, and infinite books, we're going to try to redress that situation. It's very easy to talk about all the things that are wrong in the world. It's very hard to have context around it and understand. Like every time I get into a hot shower, I say thank you to the universe. I'm not a religious person, but do you realize how we are the cosmic lottery winners? Everyone here right now, no matter what conditions you find yourself in, you are the result of millions of years of success. And you're living at a time where the world was a really dangerous, hostile place for most of human history. And the fact that we have clean drinking water and have hot showers, does everyone? I mean, that's always the thing. Yeah, but they don't have that in X. No, you're right. They don't, but they will, hopefully. But the only way they will is if you don't just sit and complain, and, have this dire view. I passionately believe that thoughts become things. And I passionately believe that what you constantly think about and what you constantly do is what you become. And, it's just I've gotten into a situation where I don't want to be around people who are just this sucks. This is awful. This is, horrible, because they're going to infect me. And so I hope that, in a way, people who are tuning in are getting pumped up, getting excited about all of these amazing innovations, discoveries, and the trajectory we're on. I honestly believe we're entering the exponential age. And the fact that we are alive during this is just so exciting to me.
Absolutely. And you can't change others. They have to want to change. But that said, I think some things are contagious, like curiosity and enthusiasm, passion is contagious. And on the other side, pessimism, and when everybody's sad about everything, that's contagious too, right? And you have to decide if you're contributing to one or the other. And one is going to encourage people to act and do something to change things, while the other will, do the opposite. But this is also a perfect segue. You're clearly a history buff, right? The talent references alone, right? But I've noticed that there's a lot of history references in Infinite Loops, but there are fewer history interview conversations or episodes. Is it because it's kind of harder to do? Or I'm curious if Infinite Loops is going to go in a more history direction at some point, or I'm just curious how you think about that.
I hadn't thought about that. In some of our other verticals, I'm very interested in developing history, like either a podcast or a YouTube channel or whatnot. I'd love to take Will and Ariel Durant's History of Civilization, all 12 or however many books there are. I've read them all, and use that as kind of a base for an exploration and a tale of history. But I don't. I don't think of Infinite Loops in that context.
Okay.
I think of it Infinite Loops as what's going on now that's really, really interesting. That's really, really different. And then I think that knowing a lot about history gives you a grounding and a context and a frame that allows you to perhaps understand what's going on now a little bit better. You can learn a tremendous amount about human OS by just knowing history and literature, of course, and other things like that. But I think you get all those references because it kind of sparks, oh, you know what? That's just like the time, fill in the blank. And, the hostility to new inventions, right? There's a great website, pessimist.org, in which they document the contemporaneous reactions that the public and or the media had to new innovations. And they hated them. Like, it goes all the way back to, well, Socrates. Writing was a mistake, man. Writing was a mistake. It just goes up all the way. And now we see the AI wars, right? And it puzzles me. It puzzles me how people's axiomatic and automatic response is, no, that's bad. That's horrible. And maybe it's just because I have no desire to control any other human being. And I think a lot of people, especially who, buy ink by the gallon, they want to tell other people what to do. I don't want to tell other people what to do. And I want to present things that I think are really cool. And hopefully other people will find they're really cool too. But the history references are more contextual from what we can learn about the way we tend to behave as a species of domesticated primates. I'm stealing that from Robert Anton Wilson, by the way. The thing that drives me mad is this bug in human OS that is, we think we know everything that there is to know. Many people do. And we quite simply don't. And you can document it endlessly. You could just go, like, if we had a time machine and we went back 500 years and we found the 12 most brilliant people on the planet, 99% of everything they believed was wrong. Just flat out wrong. And that's like, in history, society, humans, we are about becoming. We are not about being. We are about becoming. We're forever changing and hopefully growing and learning and all of that. So, yeah, that's why I personally would definitely love to watch a history specific YouTube channel or listen to a history specific. Hardcore history is a fun one.
Yeah.
But I don't put those two together in terms of the raison d'etre of Infinite Loops versus history.
That makes sense.
We've got quite a few listener questions which we were going to ask you, but just before we get to those, Michael and I were having a bit of fun before the call, trying to work out. You've mentioned in several different podcasts a few of your sort of the Jim O'Shaughnessy productivity habits, but they're very different productivity habits to it's not sort of, they're very different from the ones you read on Twitter. So the ones we got were sitting in silence for 20 minutes every morning, flipping a coin to randomly decide your actions, and which resulted in you buying 20 CDs, thanking the universe every time you take a hot shower, and then this was a bit more, perhaps more commonly discussed, is journaling every day. I mean, are there any of those? I mean, it'd just be great to hear you chat a bit more about what specifically you get out of some of those and why you do them, because they're all a bit unconventional. And a few of the listeners actually mentioned them in their questions anyway.
Sure. So I tried to meditate in the traditional sense, transcendental meditation, etc., many times, and I failed horribly at it. Another GIF I often use on Twitter is the too many thoughts with the smoke coming out of the guy's head. And so I came across this idea that you don't have to do anything. Just if you really want to clear your mind and let it kind of reset, try sitting just for 20. By the way, it doesn't have to be in the morning. It can be any time throughout the day. For example, yesterday I did it at 11 o'clock at night because I was busy doing other things. And so I'm always willing to give anything a go. And so when I read about that, I'm like, huh. And of course, the famous Pascal quote that the average man can't or won't sit for 15 minutes in a room alone. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to try that. And so the first time I did it, I just felt like an idiot. Like, okay, I don't have anything. Normally I would be reading something or chatting with somebody or whatnot, but I didn't have to do anything. So it appealed to my laziness. And
do you have a pen and paper with you?
I
let
do.
yourself write stuff down. Okay. So you allow yourself to write in that quiet 20 minutes.
I not in it. Follow.
Oh, okay. But not during.
Not during. Because and that's all trial and error stuff. What I found when I did it at first was I had what I thought was a really great idea, and I started writing it out, and then it just was like it kind of collapsed. So I realized, no, let's do the 20 minutes of that. Write it down. But about 2 weeks in, for me at least, I got this kind of amazing sense of clarity. And it's one of the reasons why I love sensory deprivation tanks. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but they used to call them lily tanks over the guy who invented them. They are amazing. If you spend an hour in a sensory deprivation tank, where literally, as the name implies, it deprives you of all your sensory data. It's pitch black. It's salt water, so you're lying in it, and you feel kind of like you're lying on the air. And you literally can start hallucinating 20, 25 minutes in. But when you come out, you're like so incredibly clear-headed that it is astounding. So I highly recommend trying that. And by the way, do it, crawl, walk, run. Try it for 10 minutes first. Don't do 20. And then see if you can do 10. And if you consistently do 10, pump it up a minute at a time, 5 minutes at a time, whatever. It's really, really effective. I don't know why. And I hate not having evidence for things I do. So there are some good scientific studies, especially around sensory deprivation tanks. But it definitely is very, very helpful. Journaling, listen, I owe my life I have written my life into existence. And I cannot overstate how important it is. At least in my case, n equals 1, right? But it's something that a lot of people who've done pretty well in the world did, right? And then I was thinking about it during one of those quiet moments here in my office, and I was sitting in a chair looking at my bookcase, and and there were all my books. And I'm like, I really did literally write my life into existence. But So that's why I'm so positive on people doing that. It can change so many things, and it just there's no downside to it.
We had a few questions about what that actually looks like in practice, what your journaling looks like in practice. Do you sit down at the same time every day with a pen and paper and answer some prompts, or do you just always have a pen and paper with you and write as you go? You've shown us some of your journals before, and because I journal in the morning, and I sometimes find it's a bit formulaic. I sometimes struggle to access the second layer. But you've shown us some of yours, and there's some crazy, something from True Detective, like crazy swirly diagrams and sort of little snippets of scripts and quotes. And is that just something that's come over time, or is that something that you think that's just how your brain works?
I think it's how my brain works. I do not do it at an assigned time. That's one area where I am somewhat different than the common advice you get, like create the habit. And Aristotle, he had a great line about habits leading to excellence. But I think that with me, because I am, as I mentioned earlier, kind of a chaotic attractor, the idea that I had to do, even if it was my own order to myself, that I had to do something at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, first thing in the morning, I must do this. I will rebel against my own rules. Like, fuck that. No, I'm not. No, it's 9 o'clock and look, boom, I'm not going to fucking write anything.
And authoritarian all the way down.
Indeed, even in my own authority. But but the habit I developed was to just do it. And so it's not always a pen and paper. I prefer pen and paper. But like if I'm going somewhere or I'm not at a location which is convenient for pen and paper, I will make voice notes in my phone and then transcribe them and often write them out in the notebook. And then that kind of that branches, right? So it leads to, I had this idea when you often see on social media people saying, my gut is never wrong. My gut is always right. And I look at these people and I'm like, your gut is probably wrong more often than it's right. But then I'm like, well, I probably should try to keep myself honest too. And so every time I have an intuition, I now record it. And that happens to be on my phone because I always have this with me for the most part. And like, if I have an intuition about something, I had a theory, right? And the theory was our memories are very, very helpful to us. They always want us to be right. And so what happens with the intuitions where you were wrong, they get memory holes. And we literally forget them. Whereas the times that we have an intuition and we're right, the brain is like, ooh, good for you. You were right again. Well, when you actually keep a list of all your intuitions, you can create a base rate. How often are my intuitions correct? And mine right now are running around 60% odd, 65%. So it's better than a coin flip. But it's hard sometimes because when you get you got to also force yourself to revisit the list. Like when you get one wrong and you're like, I was really, really wrong about that one. But
Stop
it's something, but it's exactly, it's something that you can learn from, right? Can improve your reality tunnel and your mental models with better information. And the reason you have people saying that their gut is always right is because they have not optimized for paying attention to themselves, right? And they don't understand this idea that our memories get overwritten to make them consistent with what we believe now. We're got memory hole areas where we're incorrect and not right. So, I almost always write something every day. But again, like if I was on vacation with my family in the Caribbean, most of those days I didn't write in a journal. I was happy to make notes on the phone. But it was just like, yeah, no, I'm not like in
Yep.
that mode of mind right now. So I am not, I'm not, and this is hysterical given the fact that my way of investing was rules-based, empirically designed, algorithmic security selection. that maybe that was my little bastard, as Jed McKenna would say. That's the real you trying to break out in here was like, dude, you are so not rule based that the only way you're going to succeed as an investor is to be a rules based investor.
I always like to try to go up one level to see the patterns in the system, right? And what I'm hearing in a lot of your habits is, it reminds me of the midwit curve meme, where most of the people are like in the middle, right? It's like, oh, you want to meditate, like first get this app and then follow this guided course and then get your TM mantra over there. And then you go to the Zen, monk temple, get some classes, and you're on the side and be like, just sit quietly for 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'm the idiot down here saying, hey, just sit your ass in a chair, dummy.
Journal. Pick a time every day, same time, have some prompts and figure out, and you can read. I'm sure there are books about journaling that you can read, right, to guide you through everything and all of the best ways to journal. And you're like, yeah, right, when you feel like it, however you want. It can be voice memo. I don't care. I'll just do it, right? And I think that simplicity is very, very powerful. And most people are their worst enemies because they get lost in the weeds. And like, I suffer from this sometimes, right? I'll get really into photography, right? And instead of walking around taking photos, I'll read up about all the gears and the lenses and the equipment, and I'll get lost in all the details instead of just doing the thing that's actually going to make me better at it, right? So I think that's the pattern to see here.
Jed McKenna has a great quote about that, and it's like, if you are drowning, are you going to try to enroll in a swimming class where you read about how to learn how to swim? No. You are going to be in the moment and say, please don't die. Please don't die. How do I keep my head above water? Right. And it's like, that's a really great insight. And that's kind of that first order versus second order, third order type of thinking, right? It's often a mistake to complicate things unnecessarily. And like, listen, anybody can make the simple complex. It's much more effective if you can make the complex simple. And look, let me hasten to add, this works for me. It doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone else. What you have to do is you've got to find something that it feels right for you.
Yeah.
And then think about your objectives and, do your thing. Right. And I'm just advising, figure out a way to do that quiet time, to do the journaling, to like write letters to your kids, to do all that kind of stuff. I don't care how you do it. Just figure out a way that's right for you and that you can stick with.
Yeah, I think a recurring message on Infinite Loops is also that agency, like you should take control of your life, because if you don't, there are plenty of people who will be happy to tell you what to think and what to do. And it so happens that it generally benefits them, right? But the whole world is trying to tell you what to think and what to do. And so if you don't, that void is going to be filled by someone else. I want us to get to listener questions because as I said, we could do this for 5 hours, but we got a bunch of great ones. The first one, I'll take the first one, and then Ed can go with the second. But the first one is by a friend of Infinite Loops, a friend of the OSV, Paul Millard. He asked, what would you advise parents not to worry about? And that a lot of people worry about. What are the things that people tend to worry about that you would say, like, that's not the stuff you should worry about?
Wow. I mean, like, honestly, almost everything that obsesses parents about their children. Like, your children are not you. They are, so many people think that their children's actions are either good or bad reflections on them. And that's the wrong way around as far as I'm concerned. No, they're a different human than you. And they are going to, what you should care about is how do you help them become the best of them that they can be. And don't worry about how, oh, my son is not making the starting team on, whatever your sport. Oh, I really want my kid to win that academic honor or, that particular thing. Alan Watts says that worry is an endlessly peeled onion. And like, there's just, if you want, you can figure out a million things to worry about. But like, and I often see also a reaction. So for example, I'm kind of I was born in 1960. So under the big definition of a boomer, I'm a boomer. But I'm tail end because I don't have much in common with the classic boomers who were born between 1946 and 1956 to 1958. But listen, we had much better teen years than the poor kids today. Like, nobody knew what we were doing. We did a lot of drugs and we drank a lot and we had sex and we did all of these things. And then I saw when our kids were starting to get into that age group, and we'd be at parties with other people in our age group. And they've got like spy software on their kids' phones. And like, I just was repulsed by that. And I was like, the hypocrisy of that. Like, wait a minute. Like, you're spying on your kid and they convince themselves, oh, my son would never do drugs. My son would never drink alcohol. My son would never have premarital sex. And I'm like, hello. Hey, you're just talking about the best parts of my teenage life. and you are just assuming that your kid, how do you manage that cognitive dissonance? So I guess don't worry about like whether your child achieves that next milestone that everyone else is focusing on, right? Like, in terms of education or in terms of passions or in terms of any of those types of things, just like realize that honestly, the biggest way that you influenced who your child is was when you conceived them genetically. And we all come out different. That's the beauty of it. The beauty is that, we all are little bits of flawed spiritual and genetic DNA. And everyone is unique in that sense. And so trying to make somebody something that they're not is a recipe for failure. And so watch your children, listen to your children, think when they're asking you a question, they're asking you that for a reason. They really want to know. And they don't necessarily want to lecture. They don't necessarily want to, well, you're never going to do that, Jimmy, because that would be bad. Have a conversation. Life is a verb, not a noun.
And what you say about freedom reminds me of a map that I saw, where it's like the area where a child could roam around their house, like in the 20s, and then you see a big area on the map. And then in the 50s, and it's smaller. And in the 80s, and it's smaller. And at the time I saw it, because I grew up in the 80s, it was supposed to mean like, oh, see how the 80s are so restrictive, right? And the area is so small. And I bet compared to today's kids, the 80s was, wow, like free for all, right? And it's kind of sad to see it ratchet always in the same direction and not swing back the other way.
Could not agree more. I think that free range anything is generally a better outcome. And this sense of, and look, this is a bias of mine, as you well know. I do not want to try to control my own children. Like, I obviously don't want them to, go to jail or whatever, but like I don't understand this urge that so many people have to want to control and manipulate other people. I'm just like, that's so anathema to me. And maybe one of the reasons why was like, I grew up in the 70s, right? And man, you want a free for all. Like we could be gone the entire day as long as we got home for dinner. Like our parents were like, "And what were you?" "Oh, we're just hanging out." We were doing a lot more than just hanging out, but they were like, "Oh, okay, good," you know. And so it also exposes you to like, how do you learn? You learn by making mistakes. That's like, you don't learn by doing everything right. You know, you learn by, oh, I really fucked that up. Well, Doug Adams has a great quote, which is, wisdom comes from experience. Well, I'm going to blow it because I'm thinking of a different one. But getting better at doing things comes from making mistakes and becoming wise. But you got to remember that the person who's incredibly wise got there by fucking things up all the time. And you know, that's another one of my little soapboxes that I'm on a lot. Like, the only way you can learn is by making a mistake.
I was going to say that's a very good segue into the next question, which is from another friend of the show, George Mack, who asked, what has Jim changed his mind about in the last 12 to 24 months? Or another way of phrasing it, I suppose, is what have you been wrong about? And he said, bonus points if it's something that you from 12 to 24 months ago would be very surprised about.
That's a really interesting question. I think, what would I be really surprised about from 24 months ago? Okay, something I've changed my mind about is that, and this would have really surprised me 24 months ago. I think that we have, at least in the United States, but pretty much globally, the worst class of politicians in history. And in the 24 months ago, you asked me about that, I would say, you know what? I'm just going to avoid that third rail. I am not going to, because all it leads to are the troglodytes who are going to scream at you. They're brain dead already. Let's say this so that everyone hears it. Both sides have these people, right? It's like, I used to do an experiment where it would be like, you know, you really have to stop watching mainstream cable television news because it's horrible. And then 90% of the people I would say that to would say, you know, you're absolutely right. Fox is awful, but CNN is okay. Yeah. Like, no, it's not. It's just the other tribe, and they're doing the same shit as the people over here, you know, just different pew, same church. And so 24 months ago, I was like, I'm never touching it. I'm never going to talk about politics. I'm never going to talk about all of that kind of stuff. And now I've changed my mind to the point where I'm not going to make it my thing, but there are things that 24 months ago I would not have touched. For example, this idea of Invest America, I think is the name of it, where the idea is that you give each child born in the country like $5,000 as an investment in a Brad
Gerstner's thing, I think.
Yeah, Brad Gerstner's thing. And 24 months ago, I would have said, yeah, this is cool. Now I'm going to give money to that group. I'm going to hopefully have them on the podcast. I'm going to amplify things that I think are really good ideas, even if they touch that third rail of politics, because things have just gotten so out of hand. And like, at least in this country, my God, it's like a rogues gallery on both sides of the aisle. And I just think our country, all countries, but I happen to live in the United States, we deserve better. We have all of these grifters And when you look at our history and you compare the founders, for example, with the people we have today, you should weep. And I used to kind of think I couldn't do anything about that and was very stoic and like, I don't want to have to deal with all of the troglodytes. But I changed my mind about that. And so you'll see more, and it's not going to be in any kind of traditional sense, right? I vote in every election. I'm registered independent. I voted for both Republicans and Democrats. But in the coming 12 to 24 months, you'll see a lot more content right here on Infinite Loops where I'm highlighting, amplifying ideas that I think are really interesting that other people might think are the worst thing in the world.
This is a perfect segue into a different question that we got from Matthew. No last names, but it's Real Menachem on Twitter. He says, it feels like for a lot of young people, the American dream of owning a home and having kids is out of reach. What would you say to those who have that perspective? What advice would you give them?
I want to be careful because I was going to be kind of an asshole in my response because, like, again, context. Do you know when I bought my first house, do you know what my interest rate was on the mortgage that I had to take from the seller because the banks was higher?
So you were born in the 60s. So let's say you were 20, that's 80, that's the peak, probably 15% or something.
15.75%.
Wow.
And I thought that I was getting the greatest bargain in the world because the banks were offering mortgages on 16.5% interest. Okay. So have some context. Understand that were prices cheaper back then? Yes, they were. So fair enough for them to lament the fact that real estate has gotten so expensive in their area. But first off, it's not everywhere, right? Think about options. The thing about the United States and Canada, and I would assume Bristol's going to be a lot cheaper than London, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's relative to the UK. Bristol's expensive, but still much cheaper than London. Much cheaper.
Yeah. So you okay. If your aspiration is to live in London, you might not be able to afford a nice home. But then open your mind and say, well, where else might I want to live?
Yeah.
And in your case, Bristol. In Canada, you don't have to live in Toronto. You can live in a variety of other places where the real estate is a lot cheaper. In America, like anywhere in what we on the East Coast jokingly call flyover land, is considerably more obtainable than elsewhere. And I would also just caution, be careful if that's the way you're saying things to yourself. Oh, I'll never be able to afford a house. I'll never be able to afford the American dream. Because you know what? Your brain takes you quite seriously. And the brain is like, it's the whole thinker prover thing, right? Your thinker can think anything it wants. But the minute it decides on something, the prover takes over. And if what you've decided on is that you could never afford a new home and you could never do this, guess what? You never will. Because your prover will say, yep, here's the evidence. Here, you're never going to be able to do it. And so I guess I would say, try to be a bit more optimistic. And secondly, understand that there are alternatives. There are trade-offs, right? Like, yeah, I get it. I'm really super lucky to be able to live where I live. And that's great. But like, if I couldn't afford to live here, I'd probably go, up the line. There's a lot of really quaint little towns in Connecticut that don't cost anything what the houses here on the Gold Coast cost, right? So be open to alternatives. Be open to things that might not be perfect for you, but can still get you pretty much where you want to be. And listen, I think I would never short the United States of America. the country continually reinvents itself. And, you know, who knows? Maybe one of the outcomes of the work from anywhere movement are going to be that a lot of those empty office buildings are going to be taken down and more affordable condominiums are going to go up in their place. I mean, I think that's a reasonable thing to think about. So don't lock in on a never. Don't lock in on a I will never be able to, because you won't be if you get locked in on it.
It's the old line from Henry Ford, I think, says, whether you think you can or you can't, you're right.
You're right.
And
yeah.
I also think it's very common to see people look at the past and forget about survivorship bias. So they look at those people where it worked for them, right? But people in the past had plenty of problems too. And maybe there were different problems than the one you're looking at. Maybe housing wasn't it, but you know, there were so many more recessions and deep depressions and everything. Like, maybe finding a job was a problem at all back then, or whatever, right? It's always dangerous to compare yourself with cherry-picked examples. But anyway, that's my view.
Totally agree. And just on that, I mean, when you look, like somebody was saying last night on Twitter, you know, oh, it's the most violent time in America's history. There's going to be a civil war. No, are you crazy? It's not, again, lack of context. Of context. More bombs were set off in America in the 1970s than at any other decade in America's history by disgruntled groups, terrorists, etc. 1920s, huge anarchist movement. They blew up the statue of George Washington right in front of the stock exchange, right? And then if you really want to like freak yourself out, go and look at photographs and read diaries from the time of like early American history. We are not talking a cakewalk here, folks. This was like not an easy country. And that's the whole thing, in continual improvement. And does that mean we have no problems? Of course not. We're always going to have problems. We just want to have better problems.
On a different note, Alberto, apologies if I'm not pronouncing his name right, Echevarria asks, when are you releasing an updated version of What Works on Wall Street? That book changed lives.
It's funny because like I would love to do a kind of a crowdsourced version of What Works on Wall Street. And I would love it to not be a book. I would love it to live online and have manipulatable data and become an active thing that people could test hypotheses out on. And I think it's a very worthy project. But as you both intimately know, we've got some really, really cool projects that are higher on the list to do than what works. And the thing I would say about that is, you know, for many of the factors we look at there, we are covering more than 50 years. Most market environments, except the Great Depression, are covered in that. Some of the factors we have, we do cover the Great Depression. So unless you're going to say, but what about Japan or what about Russia? You know, that's the other thing. Yeah. Okay. If there is a revolution in America and we become a communist dictatorship, then all of that historical knowledge is void, right? So because
you don't need a book to know that.
Yeah, you don't need a book to know that, right? I will have hopefully escaped, but if I haven't escaped, I will be shot against a wall anyway. So, my point is directionally, the current version of What Works on Wall Street is still going to give you pretty good advice. Directionally, those things still happen over many market cycles. The challenge there is that even people who are reading What Works on Wall Street tend to be hyperbolic discounters, right? They tend to really shorten their time horizon. And then they take the data from there that's covered like 50 plus years of market activity with a variety of market environments, and then say, but it didn't work for these 3 months, right? And like, again, 3 months, almost entirely noise, As you go out on the time horizon, less noise, more signal. When you get to about a 7-year holding period, you're getting a lot more signal than you are noise. And then when you get to like 20-year holding periods, it's virtually all signal. And so I would love to do that project. Anyone who's listening, if you could come to us at OSB and say, hey, I can do this. I love the idea of the open sourcing. What you got to do for us is get us the data sets, et cetera. Hey, then we'll do it. So that's another thing that's great about OSB. Sure, you want to do it? Get in touch with us. And if your bona fides are good and your proof of work is good, we'll do it with you.
The call is out. Next one is from John Diedrichs. He asks, how would the world full of abundance look to you in 10 years? Like if things go really well, right? And we get to something you could call a world of abundance. What's the vision?
Yeah.
What's the dream?
So I use the abundance mindset a little bit differently than a lot of people. What I mean by abundance is that it's a much more narrow interpretation. In other words, the way I look at it is we have entered an era where we can successfully play and win at win-win games. And evolution has so designed us to be scarcity mindset, right? And with good reason. For most of human history, resources were scarce. And often you had to fight over them, and the pie was one size, and you couldn't just bake more pies. We are now in a world where we can bake a lot more pies. And so what does that world look like to me? It looks like a world where there is some kind of safety net, particularly in the most technologically advanced societies, where platforms like AI and others will, in many respects, transform what people are doing. But in my version, for the vastly better. All of the cut and paste and drudge work that humans are doing right now, hopefully will be gone. That will be automated away by AI agents who do all the stuff that, come on, we frankly don't want to do anyway. And where we are able to follow our muse more than at any other time in history. And by that, I mean, like, in a world of scarcity, it makes sense to be an apprentice, to learn a craft, to learn a trade, to take that very methodical, very linear way of figuring out how you're going to support yourself and your family. In a world of abundance, hopefully you're going to have your optionality is going to increase dramatically. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it's never been easier to get a lot of things done just as an individual. I mean, they even have a term for it, solopreneur. And I think teams of diverse, cognitively diverse, let's be very clear, people end up doing better. But maybe 10 years from now, when we've got the machines linked into the human colossus, maybe that will also emerge as another way in which we have a much bigger lever to do the things that we want. So another aspect of that world of abundance to me would be a lot of people who might have, out of necessity, might have done a much more traditional 9 to 5, work for the man, stay in the corporation, the big corporation, don't do that anymore because they don't have to. We hopefully in that world of abundance, they can pursue, the things that they're good at, passionate about, and with enough of a platform where they can make an actual living at it. And so, and I guess the other aspect of it would be, I would love to see a world that things like, I mentioned safety net. I am not at all deluded about the fact that a lot of people who, through no fault of their own, are going to have a hard time in that new world. We got to figure out a way to take care of them. And so I think that there should be some sort of basic social safety net for people, be it universal basic income or something along those lines. Great example. Like, I probably wouldn't have said that if we done this 12 months ago, because I just know there's a group of people who I respect, by the way, who are vehemently against the idea of universal basic income. And by the way, there are some examples of test runs of it where it didn't work out very well. But I'm kind of this is a big change, this change from scarcity to abundance. So people are going to get lost, and we should try everything to make sure that that is minimized as much as we possibly can. So I'm willing to experiment, even if the current evidence suggests that in one particular form or another, it hasn't worked. Well, okay, let's try other ones. But yeah, the abundance that I foresee is going to basically just give regular people much more optionality than they ever had in the past.
Awesome.
I mean, actually, sorry, but you guys are excellent examples of this, both of you guys, right? Like, Ed, you're a trained lawyer, but you left the law because you had an option. And Michael, you worked and then became an independent investor, but like, you guys
all
are
my life I have to is due to the availability of the internet and abundant information and choices and connection to people, because I've never worked at anything that I trained for formally, right? It's all just autodidact.
You're trained in the law as well, by the way.
Yeah. And it was boring, and I left it as soon as I could, before even doing the bar exam. Right? But that's the thing. If I had been born like 20 years earlier, none of those choices would have been available.
Exactly.
And when we talk about abundance, we have to remember how relative it is, right? Like, today we live in a world of abundance compared to almost any time in human history, right?
Correct.
Like, the farther back you go, the more we're in abundance. So it has to be abundance compared to today, what we're looking at. But we should also, it's like Wi-Fi and planes, right? We should also appreciate what we have today and remember how lucky we are to live in a world of like antibiotics, and like the King of France couldn't like watch a movie on TV, right? Or listen to Spotify or.
That is such a good point. It's like, and it should be underlined, right? Like, compared to the King of France of, let's use Louis the 16th, right? Versailles, ended up getting his head chopped off, which was one of the downsides of being a king.
Annoying.
Ups and downs.
But like, to make it more actual real and relatable, the book America One Summer, that looks at the 1920s, by Bill Bryson. Like, I was reading that book and I was like, I can't believe this. It actually made me do a big thing on, like, my grandfather was born in 1885, right? No planes, no cars, no antibiotics. You got a sliver, you died, right? And like Spotify, the average human today, at least in North America and most parts of Europe, lives a life that a aristocrat of just a couple hundred years ago could only dream of, right? Like this idea that we can listen to any music we want for this low fee, it's incredible.
How much would someone have paid if you could magically make it work, right? Like all the dependence and everything for like an iPhone 100 years ago, right? Millions. How much would some king have paid for some antibiotics because like half of their children were dying before 5, right? Like the example I like to give is Gustav Mahler wrote a song cycle called, I don't have good German, so I'll say it in English, but it's like songs for dead children. Because at the time, like half of your kids just died, right? It was so common, and it was just as devastating then as it would be today. But it was the reality of people, and we take for granted like the beautiful life that we have today, where we don't have to deal with all that stuff.
Yeah, the cognitive shift between, I don't know when it started, but for at least people fortunate enough to live in places like where we live, like death is something you don't think about. It's basically deferred until you probably hit a certain age, and then maybe you start thinking about it more. But it's not. Whereas it's hard to imagine what it would have been like to live in a world where death was omnipresent. It's something that you would have been aware of from the moment you were born, from the moment you died, that because it would have been surrounded, and the difference that would make on your worldview is really hard for us to visualize, I think.
I was incredibly lucky when I was 22 years old and on my honeymoon. I met a guy named Percy Cowan in Switzerland, and he was ancient then. So he was born in the late 1800s. So he was well past 90 at this resort I was at. But my wife and I ended up having drinks with him and another couple who was equally old. And the stories, oh my God, it was incredible. Percy was I would love to, we should write a book about Percy because he had an amazingly colorful life. He was a pilot in World War I. He got shot down 3 times.
Wow.
And
the Red Baron.
Yeah, and escaped the containment every time. He said, the Germans weren't quite as nasty back then as they were in World War II. But I asked him specifically, and this, of course, is 1982, so I had no idea that we were going to have a pandemic. But I asked him specifically about the Spanish flu. Quite unkind to Spain, because it wasn't from Spain that this flu came.
Nope. It's all about marketing.
Branding. It really is. Really, really is. But I'm like, how did you deal with that? And he goes, what do you mean? And I went, how did you emotionally deal with it? He was like, Jim, that world, live every day like it was your last one, because it might have been. He goes, I had so many friends who died. And we were like, oh, that sucks. Let's move on. And that I really, in fact, I have a journal from that period where I wrote about that just smacked me in the face.
Dude.
The idea, I was listening to a person, a human being who was alive when people thought like that.
Yeah.
And it was just so incredible to me, because I honestly said to my wife, I'm like, I don't think we'd make it back in that world.
Yeah.
Because it was just people die. Moving on.
Yeah. Okay, we'll probably got time for one more listener Q&A. This is a quick one. Jack Connor says, favorite poem with bonus points for a little bit of recitation.
Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Favorite poem is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. That is the opening stanza by T.S. Eliot.
That's beautiful.
It's incredible. I crazily memorized lots of poems when I was young, and it actually came in very handy with the wooing the girls. They really did it. They really did like it. And so had we but whirled enough in time, this coin, this lady, were no crime. We could sit and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side, shouldst rubies find. That's To His Coin Mistress
Oh.
by Andrew Marvell.
I'm about to swoon.
Oh yeah, and you say that to a woman, and then like the rest of it continues to go on, and he's talking about how he would adore her for centuries, and he would love her and praise every aspect of her, but then he goes in for the kill. But thy eternal beauty shall not. But thy eternal beauty shall fade, and in eternal lines to time, all of this will die. And
Ooh.
like,
Took a
so,
turn.
so
Yeah.
so then he goes for closing the deal. So now let us tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our son stand still, yet we can make him run. So that's Andrew Marvell To His Coin Mistress. Like, you want to watch here's what I would do if I could, and I would just adore you forever. But, in eternal time, but at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. It's like, we're all going to die, and your quaint honor turned to dust and into ashes all my lust. Like, so you're going to be in the grave. And by the way, quaint is Victorian or Elizabethan slang for a woman's sexual organ. So they were a little more spicy than you think they were.
A little more risque,
So no, I can't do that because we're all going to die, and my lust is going to turn to dust. So, baby, let's do it.
You get all the bonus points here, Jim. That's more than a little, and all the context.
Yeah.
Wow, it's quite a tongue twister too. But I think we're reaching the end of the episode. And how can we end an Infinite Loops episode? So Ed and I brainstorm a little bit, and
think.
we're gonna make you Emperor of the World, right? But on the interview I did with you, I already asked you that question, your own question. And so there's a little twist today. We're gonna make you evil Emperor of the World. And so we want you to make humanity as miserable and unmotivated as possible with two ideas that you would incept in them. And I'm sure you understand that this is the old inversion game, right? That Charlie Munger likes so much. So do the opposite. But what would evil Emperor Jim incept the world with?
Oh, good Lord. It's like I am so that is so anathema to me. It's like
it's hard to even go there.
Okay, so if I'm incepting evil Emperor Jim, I want everyone to wake up with the idea that they are not safe. Their neighbors want to kill them. Everyone in society wishes them ill. And that's what I want them to understand and live their life according to those beliefs. That's going to get you a very, very awful world pretty quickly.
I'm getting chills down my spine. We need to Photoshop the Emperor hood over you and Star Wars and take that clip out of context.
And
that could be the episode trailer, Jim saying that.
And then the second thing I would incept is that nothing ever changes. There is no hope. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. I want you to think every morning that not only is all of your neighbors and your family and everyone else hate you and out to get you, but every morning too, you are waking up and you are walking into the gates of hell.
Wow. That's dark. Good job. The Groundhog Day from hell.
All right, guys. What did we eat up? We ate up 2.5 hours. That's awesome.
Yeah. I think very quickly, just since this is the 200th episode, it would be sort of remiss of us not just to very quickly mention our listeners. So obviously, they're the reason we're here, as well as your interest. And Julie Frederickson, who we had on a few weeks ago, said she's trying to serve as sort of the way she thinks about herself is as a weirdo lighthouse. And I think that was such a good little description. And I think that in a way describes what we're trying to do, sort of be a beacon for the most, and you mentioned it earlier, Jim, the most sort of curious and weird in a good way, and
high agency and curious.
High agency, optimistic, hungry, all these things. So that's what we've been trying to do. And I think that's definitely what we've done. So yeah, just to all the people who've been listening, many of whom have been listening for 4 years now, just thank you, and on to the next 200 episodes.
People will not believe that this is not planned, but if you actually know me and the way I operate, you know that this was not planned. I was just saying, my wife was asking me about our listeners, and I said, I think we are the luckiest podcast that's on the air, because our listeners are super interesting, super switched on people. And, we get a lot of ideas from them, and they're like, maybe you should have this person on. So thank you for bearing with all of our nonsense. Hopefully it's been at least a little bit worth it.
Perfect.
All right, guys. Thank you.